Hello, and thank you everyone for joining us in this interview. As others we are carrying out, we're interested in understanding the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on our professional and personal lives from what we call expanded reason. That is, we want to ask about the impact of the pandemic on our lives from the broad horizon of reason, like Pope Benedict would say, moving beyond the narrow scientific perspectives, for example, towards a wider, better understanding of our lives. That is, we hope to see how we live, our lives can be enriched by deeper engagement with philosophy and theology. To help us do that, we have today Professor Tyler VanderWeele of Harvard University. Professor VanderWeele, thank you very much for joining us at the Expanded Reason Institute of the University of Francisco de Vitoria here in Madrid. You're speaking to me from Oxford, where you're on sabbatical now. Before we begin, let me introduce you to our audience. Dr. Tyler VanderWeele is the John L. Loeb and Francis Lehman Loeb Professor of Epidemiology in the Departments of Epidemiology and Biostatistics at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. He's the director of the Human Flourishing Program, co-director of the Initiative on Health, Religion, and Spirituality at Harvard University, and the 2019-2020 George Eastman Visiting Professor at the University of Oxford. Eastman is in Kodak. He holds degrees from the University of Oxford, University of Pennsylvania, and Harvard University in mathematics, philosophy, theology, finance and applied economics, and biostatistics. His research concerns methodology for distinguishing between association and causation in observational studies and the use of statistical and counterfactual ideas to formalize and advance epidemiologic theory and methods. His empirical research spans psychiatric, perinatal, and social epidemiology, the science of happiness and flourishing, and the study of religion and health, including both religion and population health, and the role of religion and spirituality in end-of-life care. He is the recipient of the 2017 COPS President's Award from the Committee of Presidents of Statistical Societies. He has published over 300 papers in peer-reviewed journals, and is author of the book Explanation in Causal Inference, published by Oxford University Press. Thank you. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure being with you today.
Let me begin by asking you about the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard and how its work was affected by the pandemic. I'm not asking, of course, about telecommuting, but rather about its mission. How was it affected, if at all, by this pandemic?
So at the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard, what we're essentially trying to do is to take the set of empirical and statistical and social science techniques that are often used to study things like economic outcomes and cardiovascular disease, but to apply it to a much broader range of flourishing and well-being outcomes, such as happiness and life satisfaction, or meaning and purpose, or character and virtue, or close social relationships. So we're trying to look at flourishing or well-being in a more holistic sense, and in a sense shaped by philosophical and theological traditions. So to develop measures of meaning and purpose or character that are informed by these rich philosophical and theological traditions. That goal has remained the same throughout this current pandemic of COVID-19. We still want to study and understand and promote human flourishing. But what has changed are the means that we have to promote these things. In much of our research, for example, we've shown that religious community powerfully affects these different aspects of flourishing: happiness, health, life satisfaction, meaning, purpose, character, social relationships. And yet we've seen throughout the world that religious services have been suspended, in large part out of necessity to prevent the infection from spreading further. But then what can be put in its place? These are some of the questions that we are struggling with right now. Are these online services as effective? How to sustain meaningful relationships often established within religious communities when all one has is virtual connection? These are difficult questions, but I think these are important questions if we're going to continue to promote flourishing.
Okay. Now, our audience is mostly or almost entirely university professors. So, and for many of us, moving from classroom teaching to online teaching happened suddenly in the last few weeks. Some have experienced some of it, have some experience with it, but for many of us, this was the first time, and it was a rush to get going, and probably disconcerting in some ways. What would you say to people in these educational entities, institutions that are doing this for the first time, and especially to the professor that finds himself now or herself separated from the class, from the students that he was used to or she was used to, engaging personally? Is there a word that you could to give to them on these from your work?
Well, I certainly wouldn't consider myself an expert on online teaching,
No,
and I
but
sort
I
of
don't mean
struggle
about
with
the
some of the
technique.
same things. But you know, I do think while trying to establish a new, lecturing style and approach to engagement is important, and learning to use these technologies, I think just as important is also how to recreate some of the circumstances that exist in an in-person classroom setting that are much more difficult to achieve online. Subtle things such as what happens with the student discussions before and after the class takes place. Is there a way to continue to encourage those more informal interactions, both for the purposes of building relationships amongst the students, but also for their more informal exchange of ideas. I think trying to ensure a format where there maybe is that sort of student interaction and discussion, perhaps with the professor absent, in fact, would be worthwhile. Likewise, I think another somewhat intangible aspect of the teaching experience, which is difficult to replicate now that we've moved online, is the handful of students who come up to the professor afterwards with specific questions, which they may not have been willing to ask in front of the entire class. So finding ways to bring that about as well. Perhaps something like following the lecture, scheduling little 5-minute sessions which students can sign up for in a request in real time by email to allow those interactions. Because while the lecturing and the classroom material is important, I think many of these subtle ways in which people learn are often as important, and we need to find ways to replicate that.
Moving on now a little bit to, well, again, to the question of human flourishing, your program, and society at large. You work in the field of epidemiology, but biostatistics, and also economics. Can you tell us a little bit about the reality that we live in today from the perspective of human flourishing and some of the things that you've been looking at?
Yeah. So I think it's very clear that with regard to these different domains of flourishing, the economy is under threat, and physical health is under threat, and these are real, and there are going to be losses. We need to do the best we can to confront them, to minimize the economic damage, to try to prevent the spread of the virus. But these have rightly occupied a great deal of our effort. But there are other aspects of human life and human flourishing that I think are important not to neglect. There are social relationships. There's mental health issues, not just the risk of infection, but issues of depression and of anxiety. Also questions of meaning and purpose. How do we make sense of what is happening? And I think we need to devote adequate attention to these other issues. How do we promote better relationships? Are there ways we can address some of these mental health issues, depression, anxiety, using online tools, online cognitive behavioral therapy? How do we, as individuals and as communities, make sense of and find meaning in what is taking place? How do we find meaning in the suffering that is real and that is being experienced?
Can
And
you
there, I
connect
think,
that to some of your studies on prayer and spirituality that I know you've done?
yeah. Um, as I had indicated a little bit earlier, we've done a number of studies on participation in religious community, religious service attendance, and the effects on sort of lowering depression, decreasing dramatically suicide rates, improving relationships, improving one's sense of meaning and purpose in life. And so I think those communities are very important because participation in those is somewhat restricted now. I think moving towards practices like personal prayer and devotion, or in the context of families, family liturgies and devotions can be at least a partial substitute to try to address some of these issues. But certainly within the Christian tradition, I think there are profound reflections on suffering itself and how to find meaning in suffering, how to reevaluate one's life, how to help others who are likewise suffering, how to turn one's will and attention to God. And I think in the context of this present suffering, many of those theological resources are likewise going to be very helpful.
You're on sabbatical, I understand now, at Oxford University. You started last August, I assume?
Yeah.
Did the pandemic, which at that point we weren't expecting, change anything of the work you're doing now?
It did. I had kind of been continuing along with my sabbatical projects for some time, one of which was devoted to a book on a theology of health, not just healthcare, but health itself. And then a second project, somewhat more technical in nature, on issues of measurement, which we wrestle with when we're trying to assess things like suffering or meaning and purpose or spiritual well-being. But when the present pandemic hit at least the West in full force, I felt some sense of obligation to shift at least some of my efforts to other research pursuits. And so some of that has been writing pieces on how we can try to flourish even in the midst of the present pandemic. Some of it's been oriented towards how religious communities can understand what's taking place and provide alternatives and prepare for the end of lockdown measures. And then some of it has been more statistical in nature on sort of the need for better information and the modeling that we're doing, more representative testing, so we actually know what infection rates are and what infection mortality rates are and how good the tests are performing. The fact that we don't know these things and that we're not doing representative testing makes the models very uncertain, and there's a lot of variation, which makes decision making very difficult. And given the economic and social costs of these lockdown measures, I think it's essential to have the best possible data upon which to make these decisions. So a piece that was just published a few weeks ago in the American Journal of Public Health along with some of my colleagues, walks through some of these issues and sort of advocates for putting better surveillance systems into place so that we have better data on which to make these important and critical decisions which affect so many different aspects of flourishing.
Can I ask you this may sound as a personal question. It's more an intellectual personal question, or a personal question at an intellectual level. Your intellectual interests are very unique in the sense that they span very different fields, very radically different fields. Can you explain to us or tell us a little bit about what brought you to, from mathematics to theology, finance and economics to biostatistics and so on? Where does it all, how did it all come together?
Well, a full description of that would occupy several hours, but I will try to condense it into as short a narrative as possible. But essentially, my study of mathematics as an undergraduate led me to want to find applications of mathematics that would contribute to the well-being of the world, which pulled me first into finance and economics, and then later on into public health, into biostatistics. I pursued more technical studies, more mathematically oriented studies in biostatistics and the development of methods to assess causation for a number of years, but was engaged in a number of epidemiologic projects on birth outcomes, on mental health, and on various other topics. As I pursued that work, I eventually came to this question of the role of religious community in promoting health and well-being. I discovered there was a large research literature on this, but many open questions with regard to causation, which was my methodologic focus. And so I began to pursue work on religious communities in health and well-being using sort of the most rigorous possible data and the most rigorous possible methods. And that work showed that weekly religious service attendance would reduce 10-year mortality rates by 30%, reduce rates of depression by 30% over time, reduce suicide rates by 5-fold. So these were large effects on important outcomes, and we really don't talk about the role of religious communities in shaping population health very often. That then led to this question of what else shapes population health, which we don't adequately study. So that led to work on parenting practices and on forgiveness. And then I began to think, what outcomes do people care about that we are not adequately studying? We study very well economic outcomes and health outcomes. And people care deeply about these things, but they also care about being happy, about meaning and purpose, about trying to be a good person, about their relationships. And so I thought, why don't we use the same set of rigorous empirical methods to try to examine these other aspects of well-being, of flourishing, as we do with physical health and economic outcomes. And that's what led 4 years ago to the formation of the Human Flourishing Program and this empirical study of flourishing informed by philosophical and theological traditions. So that's, I guess, a very brief summary of the overall trajectory.
Are students, undergraduate students or graduate students involved in these projects?
Yeah, we've had a number of graduate students, especially, carry out work on different aspects of flourishing and of well-being. We have had some undergraduate participation as well. We've hosted some summer seminars, and we've also taught some 4-credit courses within Harvard College on these topics. Most of our work is focused on research, and so we've had more substantial interaction with graduate students and postdoctoral fellows, but we do have an educational aim as well, and so we have had some interaction with undergraduates also.
Okay. One last question about returning back to the initial issue of human flourishing. The work of a university professor anywhere is often understood in either, well, not either or, but oftentimes happens to be oriented towards the formation towards a degree requirement so that a student can achieve a job. We would like to say that we, and many of us who are involved in education beyond, thinking of it as pure professional formation, we're thinking about the human formation of the person, the development of the mind, critical thinking, and so on. What advice would you give to a professor that is just beginning to thinking about their own vocation as a professor, who may be a professor in a very scientific field or very technical field, and how would you encourage them to move beyond towards, to use the words of Pope Benedict, to broaden the horizon of reason, to look at their field of study and the work that they do with students beyond just the pure technical aspect, but more towards towards human flourishing, both for themselves and for the student?
I think it's a very good question, and one which has no easy answer. I think the advice I would give, and the approach I've tried to take myself, is that really throughout one's work, throughout one's career, one's research, one's teaching, from time to time, an hour or two a week, maybe even devoting a week during each year, to come back to questions with regard to how is my work related to broader questions of flourishing and human well-being, and also what is the relationship overall of my discipline to questions of flourishing and to faith or to religious understanding. And I think that continual process of coming back to those big picture questions over time, again and again, begins to help shape the mind to think in new ways, to pursue new questions, to realize how one's deepest theological or philosophical beliefs and positions might go on to inform one's work. And I think that process typically does not take place with a single epiphany. It takes place through developing habits, and by returning to these questions again and again. In my own experience from my early graduate student days, I was really wrestling with how does my Christian faith relate to my academic work, and for a long time I really had no answers, but kept struggling, kept asking those questions, kept trying to talk to others about these matters. And it was really only, I would say, 10 years later that some of these connections began to come together in a clearer way. And I began to see a way forward where the content of my day-to-day work was being informed by my deepest beliefs. But I still very much see myself on that journey, and every year that goes on, I see deeper connections and new research pursuits. The newest undertaking of the Human Flourishing Program is going to be to try to develop a philosophically and theologically adequate assessment approach to love, which I think is central in human flourishing. Very difficult to wrap one's head around the diversity of the ways that word, that concept is used, and challenging moreover to attempt to measure it. But I think if we're really going to improve the well-being and the ultimate well-being of our world in substantial ways, we need to understand these things. But I would have never anticipated undertaking such work 15 years ago. So for me, it really has been a gradual process, but I think one that can only come about by persistent effort and by returning again and again to those questions which may at present seem tangential to one's day-to-day work, but there are probably deeper connections than one realizes.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. VanderWeele, for your words and for joining us at the Expanded Reason Institute at the University Francisco Vitoria in Madrid.